Hi, I'm Nick Bradley. I help business owners and founders optimize their business for freedom and financial independence. I've spent over 12 years in private equity, and now I work on growth, scale, and exiting companies.
Always exit?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's always the outcome.
Yeah. Okay. do you ever...
The way I explain it, though, is like that might be the Big Mac, and there is always a happy meal that starts before that.
Are you ever in a position where you meet somebody who thinks they want to exit and you persuade them not to?
I don't talk about exiting as always selling your business, though.
Okay.
So here's where it's a little bit different as a distinction. I talk about being able to exit your business without selling it quite a lot, because I talk about it in the transitions that business owners have to make. And the thing about private equity that's really interesting to me is that we are unapologetically real business owners. We don't really give a shit about operating the company, right? We're there to maximize the value of the asset. And it is possible for a founder to become a real business owner if they release themselves from the operation and live a fantastic life, with income and everything else like that without having to run the business. So that in its own right is an exit in my mind, in my book.
Yeah, I often talk to clients about there's three things: income, equity, and control, and those three things are separate. Often they get merged together. Often people think that they're the same thing and you can't unpick them, but you can definitely unpick them.
I talk about the same things. I talk about having a business that runs independently, then having a business that generates, cash flow and income, and then one that has transferable value.
Yes.
And, depending on how far along the line you want to go, you can then transition to being someone who sells their company, or you can have a business which gives you enough freedom and that's what you want. So it's more of an optionality than it is anything else.
And what size businesses are you, I guess, in terms of number of employees, are you typically working with?
It depends on the industry, of course, but I tend to come in at the phase where they're starting at that sort of 20 to 30 employees and then going up into the hundreds. And quite often it's that point where, as you know, the complexity increases and everything that was great during the beginning starts to fail. Yeah. And you need to operate in a different way. And the other thing around that is, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, the identity of that business owner has to shift and change. So it's as much about who they become or who they're becoming as it is about how the business evolves from that.
Or in fact, whether they want to change at all. I had Ruth Turner on, and she talks about the warrior at the beginning, and then the architect, and then the sort of the monarch or head of state. And I was talking to somebody recently, and they'd got to 70 people, and they just said, you know what, yes, I could clearly see I needed to become a different leader, but I just didn't want to.
Wow, it's a personal choice.
So I've hired somebody else to run it. I'm an introvert. I love it when it's like 10 to 15 people. So, we've promoted somebody internally, and I'm playing around with some other startup ideas.
I'll be honest with you, that's what I'm doing. So this is, well, I talk about businesses in terms, maybe this is a little bit too simplistic, but I like to simplify things as best I can. I talk about lifestyle and I talk about growth.
Yeah.
Right. And my business is a lifestyle business, which is a kind of paradox on the whole idea that I help people sort of exit. And certainly there's a selling component. So people say to me, aren't you going to sell your company one day? You come from private equity. I go, I have no intention. So I've been involved in so many transactions. I've got PTSD around it. So I'm quite happy to help other people do it. But I like to participate in minority investments these days as opposed to building my own thing again.
Well, it'd be different. Building your business for you to create an asset would be very different. It's exactly the choice that you said earlier. You could have an amazing business. It could be great fun, but you just say, look, this isn't an asset. This is a lifestyle business. That's fantastic.
Well, it comes down to choices. I had a business many, many years ago that I started from the beginning and sold, not very successfully, but I did that back in my early 20s. And then when I was in private equity, I was the CEO of investor-backed companies where the whole goal is growth to exit. So once you've gone through the rigmarole of that, it's tiring, right? So to do that multiple times in your life, I'm quite happy traveling around, seeing my kids and helping other people and doing all that. It's a much more fun existence for me.
Well, and also there's a time pressure on it. No, it's not just sort of grow the value of the asset, it's grow it at a particular pace. And so, tiring.
Yeah, you've got metrics in private equity as well, internal rate of return, and then multiple of invested capital, and all these kind of crazy things, which I won't bore you with. But you have to get as you said, a speed of return and a maximization of return for investors, and the pressure that everyone is put under to achieve those kind of ratchets and milestones is pretty huge. So I don't think most people I know who've been in private equity for a long time have a point where they say, you know what, enough is enough, just because it is quite relentless.
When you start working with somebody, let's dig into. You said earlier you've got a book coming out, Exit for Millions, coming out in a few months' time. So I guess dig into some of that. What are some of the things that are there some myths or misconceptions that people have about private equity that you are constantly surprised by?
Some things I'm surprised by, some things I'm not. Some things I like to lift the Komodo on, and other things I'm sworn to secrecy.
Right.
But in fairness, the book, though, is interesting because there is a chapter, probably my favorite chapter in the book, where I unpack private equity through the lens as if you were invited to a private members club in London for a night.
Uh-huh.
And these places exist, and they don't have signs on the door, and they're not the typical ones like a Soho House or anything like that anyone can be a member of. They are specifically for hedge fund owners, private equity guys, VCs, whatever. And the conversations that happen behind those doors, particularly when a deal is done successfully, or coincidentally when one isn't done successfully, it's proper laddish behavior and crazy amounts of money spent on fine wine. So I talk a little bit about that in the book, just to kind of give a picture of what this is. And the summary is it's unapologetically about money. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. That's the world, like it for what it is. It's what I say. If you want to win the game, you need to learn the rules, but don't hate the game.
Yeah.
But, in terms of your question, I think one thing I will say is that there's this kind of love-hate view, I think, generally of private equity. A lot of people see it as this exploitation. They're going to buy your company as cheaply as possible. They're going to find hidden value. They're going to make millions, if not billions, out of something that you started and you created, right? And that is the thesis, right? It's buy low to sell high.
You don't need to sell. If that's going to make you unhappy, don't sell it.
Well, exactly. And there is a really interesting thing going on, which I'll talk about the importance of private equity, right? Because back when I was involved, I think the figure was something like 30% of all large transactions, 8 or 9 figure transactions, had private equity involvement, meaning either direct investment or they were backing another company that was going to buy, your company. And the figure now over the next decade is it's going to go up to close to 70% of all transactions will have private equity involvement. Mm-hmm. So what that means is if you do have the ambition to sell your company for 8 or 9 figures one day, you have to understand private equity because they're going to be there in whatever way.
Yeah.
So what I say to people is, even though they've got this stigma and this reputation, they also can be a fantastic partner. And you, as the business owner, have to choose who that partner is, as opposed to it being the other way around. And that's where I think things start to flip in terms of the involvement.
And so how might people pick? Maybe you've got an updated stat for me. Certainly, it feels to me that when clients or data I've seen sell to private equity, only about, particularly if there's an earnout, about a third of the people are still there at earnout. 2/3 of them have gone. So my advice is always, make sure you're getting everything. So if you have to walk away before the end of your earnout, you don't hate everybody in the world, that you actually got enough. You got enough at the beginning. And so part of that is, who to pick. Is my stat about right? Is it about a third, do you think? Or is your experience different?
Private equity has evolved over since COVID, let's say, have changed because they've had to change. The whole way they invest has adjusted based on the interest rate rises. So the way private equity works, and I'll kind of get into your question as well, but the way private equity works is they obviously leverage a lot of debt traditionally to buy a company. And that's normally something along the lines of about 70% of a transaction was debt. Mm-hmm. And 30% of the transaction was done through investor funds. A lot of people don't really appreciate that or realize that. And then because they've bought that entity at a low cost of capital, they pay the debt off and then get a kicker on the whole valuation. Now, as interest rates have gone up and the access to free money has changed, the diligence, if you like, around the private equity firms to partner more and look at the strategic value of a company has increased incredibly, which has meant that the private equity firms have to position themselves to be more specialists in how they can increase that strategic value as opposed to just the financial value. And that changes the positioning of private equity in terms of how they have to behave and operate.
So, and what do you reckon, when the people you're working with, what you got a proportion of them that are still there at the end of their earnout versus?
There's a trick.
Hate work, because they started the company often because they didn't want to be an employee, and then they find themselves. I suppose it's not so much that when they are private, there's definitely private equity ownership or even private equity backed strategic purchases, and either way you end up responsible to somebody else.
It comes down to how you want the deal to be structured. So there are some distinctions that I talk about when I advise people of how to navigate this world successfully, which I'll go through. But to your point, like earnouts, you've got earnouts and you've got rollover, right? And I try and negotiate zero earnout, right? So we're going to put everything into a rollover. So let's say you do sell 70% of your company or 60% of your company. It tends to be around that ratio depending on what's going on. You want to take the majority of that out as cash at close. So it's not uncommon to get a 60% of the valuation cash at close, and then there'll be an earnout, or there'll be an earnout and rollover. I tend to push everyone to rollover, which basically means you've bought shares at the same level, ideally, as the private equity firm, and then you are a partner. If they decide to kick you out, or what often happens is once you go into that world, you realize there's probably someone better that can come in and take the vision of my company and grow it to the next level, right? That happens too. So it can be a very joined up way of thinking about it. I still keep my shares, right? I still keep my 20 or 30% or whatever it was. And actually the ability to then go through to the same end game as the private equity firm and sell and make money, you can make the same amount of money or more again. So it just depends. But what I don't suggest is that, you sell your company unless it's a distressed sale. What you take off the table in that first transaction is not hitting the number that you want to achieve, because you're right to say you've lost control over that earnout once the transaction's done. Yep.
Let's pick your brains then on the other side of the table then. What do I need to know about private equity? How are they valuing my business? What if I'm a couple of years away and I'm thinking I might do this in a couple of years' time? What are some of the things I need to line up to maximize my value?
The first thing to understand is the private equity firms will have a view, certainly it's when I was actually in working with them directly, that a big deal is as complex to kind of get over the line as a smaller deal. So we might as well focus on bigger deals. So back in the day when I was involved, it used to be around about a 5 million EBITDA level where we would get involved in the mid-market, meaning that you have to have a company that's delivering that level of profitability before you would start to open up the private equity. It's dropped a little bit to about 3 million now, and sometimes even a little bit lower than that if it's going to be a bolt-on business to a strategic acquisition that private equity has already made. But you've got to be getting into the 7 figures of EBITDA to give yourself a chance to be sold to private equity. And as I said beforehand, around 70% of transactions are going to involve private equity if you get to that level. So if you're below that level, your chances of selling the business are low. And your chances of selling your business for a reasonable multiple are going to be compromised as well. So that's the first thing, right? So if you want to have a chance, you've got to get the EBITDA up to, I say, around about 3 million.
Yep.
In terms of how you maximize value, so this is an interesting statistic I was looking at recently. Back in 1975, I was looking at the S&P 500 data.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you've seen this slide. It's a fantastic slide. I had it here a minute ago, which said that the percentage, here we go. You like this. So back in 1975, 83% of the value of a company was based on tangible assets, basically GAAP accounting and the finances. 17% was based on what we call strategic value or intangible assets. In 2020, and this is again market value of the S&P 500 in the US, 90% is based on intangible assets and only 10% on the numbers. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So what that means to your question is you can flex the multiple by how you build the company, how you position it, different levels of kind of IP or ownership, structuring, all those things. And the first question that a private equity firm is going to ask you is, tell me your vision, the growth vision. And I often say that, companies in my mind are actually sold, not bought. and they're sold on how well you can package all of those components up well in advance of going to market and securing a transaction.
So if I paraphrase you a bit, then rather than saying your business is not worth what, based on your business is probably worth more, if you can tell a story about what it's worth your acquire in the future rather than just looking at the historical transactional value.
It should always be based on the forward, exciting or compelling future versus the proud history.
Yeah.
Because the table stakes are the numbers we just spoke about, right? So unless you're at 3 million, 4 million, 5 million EBITDA, you're not even going to have a conversation, right? But the thing that makes the biggest difference is the multiple. And the multiple is an arbitrary number. The multiple is not made up of anything other than how attractive your business is to that acquirer based on what they're going to do with it.
And how much does growth figure in this calculation of the multiple, growth rate?
Growth rate is important, but not as important as what the entity can do to the business. So let's say, like, if the business is going backwards, let's say it's declining, that's just going to be a reason to negotiate the multiple backwards and the valuation down. So you kind of want to give yourself the opportunity to mitigate any sort of retrading or anything like that where the value is going to be less. But what you don't know and what no one knows is what the private equity firm or the strategic buyer can do with what you've created.
Mm-hmm.
So their math and your math are very different. So one thing I always advise is don't ever try and sell the business based on your math, right? What you think it's worth. You want to understand what you want to work out through the process of due diligence and building a relationship with your potential acquirer where they see the value. And that's your negotiation point.
Yes. A couple of years ago, one of our clients exited and he thought it was worth 30 million. And then when he went out to hire somebody to sell it for him, he appointed the people who said it was worth 120. And he's forever disappointed that he only got 70 for it. Which is,
what a great story.
I would tease him a little bit about that. It's like, you thought it was worth 30 and you got 70. And he's like, yeah, but they told me it was worth 120. It's like, okay, well, this just...
God, that says everything. You know, that one example there, Dominic, says everything about how arbitrary this whole thing is.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been involved. The biggest transaction I was involved in, an education company, we thought it was going to sell for about 18 times. A very, very good sort of ed tech business. Sold for 36 times to a private equity firm in Germany. And the reason the deal got done is they'd missed out on so many deals previously. They had to do a deal. I mean, you know, that was the main thing. And so the owners of this business were like, we thought we were going to make X, and they made double just because of that nuance. Crazy, right?
Well, I was talking to somebody recently who they made nearly 20 times revenue, and they thought they were going to make 10 times revenue. And again, they just had two strategic buyers who were knocking each other to death because they both wanted it, but what they most wanted is the other one not to have it. So...
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, my background, I cut my teeth in a business called Getty Images back in this sort of 2009 to about 2012. And we sold the business twice at that point. But I was involved in, 30-something acquisitions. 42 were done while I was there, but the ones I was involved in. And we were just buying people up to hoover up the market. But the other thing is if anyone was a threat, we would just buy them to take them out.
Yeah.
So there's lots of reasons that these things happen.
So what else should people know? Thinking about, obviously they shouldn't necessarily be thinking about just driving EBITDA. There's a multiple to be had of EBITDA. And what drives that? Growth's one component. What else do you see as solid vision for the future?
Well, so growth and scale and size gives you different thresholds on the multiple. So, the thesis being that a bigger business is less risky, has more resources around it than a smaller business. So you'll hear different statistics, right? But like a business that's doing under $1 million of EBITDA, the multiple there might be somewhere between 2 to 5 times, right? If you're lucky, the lower you go, the less valuable it is because you're buying a job, right? Obviously. Yeah. But then when you go over those thresholds, because you open the market up, you can get to your double-digit multiples. And I often say to people, that's like someone writing a check, let's say it's 15 times EBITDA. That's like 15 years of profit you're getting in one day, right? So it's crazy that someone has that level of certainty or sees that level of value. So you've got that piece. But The other things, there's 15 different criteria that I used to look at through private equity, and we would go through that through a due diligence process. So I'll go through some of those things now, but as I said, I've got a resource that I can give to people around that so they can actually assess their company against those 15 criteria as well. I think the main thing is the amount of dependence that a business has on its founder. So the idea that if you have a business where you are still the owner operator versus the what I call the real business owner, the person who has put in a leadership team to run your business, then that has a massive compromise on the value of your company. And the line I often say to people is, the more valuable that you are to your company, the less valuable it is. So you've got to reduce that reliance by building structure, people, process, right, leadership, and that's key, right? No one's going to buy a business where you're the risk, key person dependence. The other ones that jump out are things like any customer concentration issues. That is obviously where you've got too much revenue reliant on a single customer or client, or a small pool of customers or clients. Because again, like when we look at assessment of value, we're looking at the risk around that more than anything else. And if 2 or 3 of those leave or something like that, the whole revenue model breaks down.
It's a good rule of thumb, but we worked with a client a few years ago that got to 15 million and all of its revenue came from one client. And it didn't stop a very large global consulting business acquiring them, because in the scheme of things, they dealt with all of the other people in the marketplace. So this business had, massive customer concentration, but once it rolled into their business,
it's not a customer concentration issue then. You see, this is where the risk that you may see in your business is not a risk for someone else. So in a private equity context, the key thing I think when you look about a private equity or a strategic sale, and I tend to focus on those two, I don't get involved in ESOPs and all the other bits and pieces that you have options around. But if you focus on that, like a private equity, if they're going to buy you as a platform, which means you're the first acquisition in a market that they want to get into, they're going to look at your business as a standalone. So everything that your business doesn't have any other component to it at that point.
Yeah.
Whereas to your point, right, if I'm going to get assimilated into a massive business that already has, let's say there's 15 big players in the market and they've got 14 and you've just got the one.
Yeah.
As soon as that's acquired, there's no risk to me. If anything, it's just going to get assimilated. So therefore the value is going to be higher.
And the reason I mention it is because I've got a number of businesses that I've run and scaled or clients where actually, I talk to founders and they say, I'm worried about the fact that, we've got some customer concentration. And so often just, 1 or 2 big clients, you could, grow the company so much faster. If you think the potential is to exit to strategic versus PE, then it's not the challenge that you might perceive it to be.
No,
you'd probably rather double the company than not grow the company because you're worried about customer concentration.
It depends on your exit strategy, right? So, I often say that it's quite good to decide on a pathway, even if you have some flexibility and options very early on, certainly a few years before you're going to orchestrate some form of sales process. And what I found to be true is I've got a client right now who 75% of their revenue is in one business. And they want to diversify that because they want to give themselves options to open up private equity as a potential acquirer. Mm-hmm. But it's very clear that if they didn't want to do that, they should just target strategics that maybe want to expand into different geographies or into different product sets. And if they go out there and actively build a relationship early on with those through a partnership or a joint venture, quite often those things turn into exit strategies in their own rights or sales processes.
Yeah.
So it really does depend. And the one thing I often say to people is, I'm sure you'd say the same thing to your clients, is you've got to get ahead of the intention to exit to create the best optionality around it, even if you have no desire in the immediate future to press the button on that outcome, right? Because it doesn't hurt you at any stage.
You're going to be ready.
Exactly.
Being ready is not a negative thing at all.
No, never is. It's, that whole, I often say about being proactive, or the way that I talk about it is make sure you play offense when you know that, defense might win championships, but offense is going to give you momentum. So you've got to understand that leading that process and what I call sort of sell side control, right, is an important characteristic early on, because it just starts to give you those options, which is powerful.
As people are thinking of scaling sort of 30 through, I often think there's a sort of an inflection point at 100. What are some of the challenges that you're helping them overcome? We talked a little bit about leadership and elevating themselves out of that.
Yeah, I talk about it through three lenses or three different exits, really. The first one's, I mean, people do come to me when they're stuck in the chaos. And the chaos, you'd be surprised, that doesn't mean a small business, Dominic. I mean, God, I had one that was doing 85 million turnover and the bottleneck was still the founder, right? So they can't take a holiday because if they leave, no one knows what to do because they haven't built, the right structure around them. So I often say that, you've got to exit the chaos. And for me, that's removing yourself from being the cog in the machine, right? That has to happen. And then after that, you have choices. It's a bit like a choose your own adventure, right? So you can exit that chaos to be a CEO if you choose to, right? And quite often people will do that. And my view on a CEO is a CEO doesn't necessarily, run the business. They're involved in the more strategic things. They are involved in building the team, building the culture, knowing the numbers, but they're not there to lead everything, right? You can bring other people in for that. But once you've done that, you can make a choice. Do I want to exit the operation and then bring in a CEO to run the business? And then you can operate like that real business owner that I mentioned before. You can sit there for a long period of time with a degree of freedom and financial independence if you choose. And then the final one is obviously exiting the business, where you can go from what I say business owner to investor by creating a capital event. So I think, my view on the whole thing is people just have to understand that there is a transition that people have to make. It's not necessarily about the size of business, even though to grow and scale your business, quite often that founder or that owner operator has to go through those different stages of their own dimension to be able to get to that outcome.
And when people start working with you, how quickly is there a equity event?
Usually I have people join me quite early on. And I say the first pathway, this is more of a growth and scale piece. And I do believe, maybe I'm biased by it, that I think the way that private equity is unattached and objective around their businesses as assets, I try and teach that thinking to founders when they are very emotional about what they've created. And you're never going to get to the point where you're fully detached from it because you created the thing. But there is the kind of operating from 30,000 feet perspective, which is important, which allows you to see everything as it is. So I often say the first milestone is get to $1 million of EBITDA. Now you might make the choice that you've got a lifestyle business and you just, I didn't want to do that. So that's fine. Well, I don't work with those businesses. Like, a great lifestyle business, as I said, brilliant. But if you want to be a growth business, let's get to $1 million EBITDA. Let's make that the first milestone. And I'll work with businesses to that outcome. And then once they hit that, the next pathway for me is to get into that swim lane of 3 to 5 million, where we start to open up the markets for a capital event. And that's where my consultancy business, High Value Exit, exists. So growth and scale to a point. And some people just jump off at that point because they've got to $1 million of EBITDA. They're making incredible money, no intention to ever sell the business at this stage. And they're very, very satisfied with the outcome that they've got.
And types of business, you do tech or
all sectors?
Anything?
All sectors. In my background, so I started off, I've been in health and fitness, I've been in retail, I've been in e-commerce, I've been the CEO of HR services businesses and media businesses and education technology businesses. So the principles, again, in private equity are that business has certain things, certain characteristics to it that are the same across all industries. And what I often say is that anyone I work with is usually an expert in their industry, but they may not be an expert in what the business needs to become.
Yes.
And that's the differentiator, I think.
Yes. Somebody asked me recently if I was an expert in their business, and I said, was that the reason that they were in the chaos? Because they didn't know enough about their business? And it was like, no, that's probably not it. I said, well, I think that answers that question. If you feel like you need more expertise in your business, that's totally different. But
what do you think, though, Dominic? You've been doing this for a while. There is certain things that are predictable, right, in business that you start to see patterns forming.
Yeah, there are, and I think particularly as people are scaling past, I think at about 30. Right, the notion of culture often rears its head. They hadn't been thinking about it. Then all of a sudden, employees stop putting the cups in the dishwasher, and it's like, oh, maybe we need to think about who we're hiring and what this needs to look like. And And then you bump into somebody that somebody else has hired and you think, who are you? Who hired you? How did you get in? If I'd been doing the hiring, you wouldn't have got in. And so that the whole recruitment process must be broken that we didn't realize was broken. And then as you get towards 100, maybe 70, I think there's this sense that, maybe we've got this executive team, but the executive team is now a mix of executives and heads of or managers of departments. And sometimes there's 12 people or 15 people because we haven't had the conversation that the business is bigger than, where you were. And certainly the business is going to be much bigger than where you are now. Often the visionary founder is holding on to accountability and they need to give it up because they're not very good at that. They're great about thinking about the next. So often I get calls from people and they say, I'm not enjoying this at all. This the admin nature of the business. It's like your £80 million business and the owner, operator, founder still in chaos. They haven't extricated themselves from that. And they need to do that. But the tools that I use, Vern Harnish's scaling up methodology and some bits of EOS thrown in there and, Jim Collins and Patrick Lencioni, I think they are applicable to, I've worked in retail. I've worked with clients who are in retail. I've worked with primary schools up in Birmingham. You can take the same tools and say, how do we get a strategy? That tool to generate a strategy is the same irrespective of the business. Have we got a great culture? That's a key thing. When people say they're going to do a thing, do they do a thing? Have we got a business that operates, we turn ideas into things, and then have we got enough cash? Have we, are we generating the profit that we would like from our operations? And I think even if you're in education, it's not about profitability, it's about cash flow, but it's the principles are the same.
Yeah. All of those things I agree with 100%. And, the interesting thing in it, we touched on this in the beginning, is how the leader evolves around their own identity through that journey. Because, and it's funny, I was working with a business recently out of the US, big business, doing in the 9 figures of revenue, 8 figures of profit. And the business was building towards a sales process, but the founder literally freaked out. Like what do they say? The thermostat was getting too hot or whatever for them. And they just went on a rampage and tried to constrict the business back to their comfort zone, which is fascinating. And I see that happen quite a lot as well. So there's a piece where if you don't really think this stuff through and give yourself the time to think about the vision you're creating and what it means for you personally, you can sabotage that.
Oh, and I think some of that self-sabotage can be it's unconscious.
Johari's window is, remember that expression of some things and some things you're unaware of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and in some ways, that not being sure what you want is a bit like people buying a gym membership and then not going to the gym and then going, that gym membership was a total waste of time. I didn't get fitter. There's a difference between wanting to scale your business and then putting the time and the effort in to scaling 100%. Your business.
Well, I often say to people, it's a choice, right? And one of the first questions I will ask people is, what's the ambition here, right? Usually there is some form of liquidity event that someone wants, but it can be a long way out. And I'll say, okay, yeah, but you realize that the stage you're at now, let's say you are under $1 million of EBITDA and you've got 15 people or something like that. I say, the next stage is going to be really painful, right? Do you really want to do this? Right? If you do want to do this, because the outcome at the end of it can be fantastic for you if that's the goal, but don't think this is suddenly going to be the same as what it was like when you started. And sometimes people go, I need to think about this.
Yes. Well, and particularly at the point that you've picked there at 15, right? Because they are going to be much less profitable until they get to sort of mid-20 employees. So they're going to be almost having to double the size before they get back to where they are now. And they're going to have to build out some sort of management team. And at 15 people, maybe it's the founder and all his helpers. So it's going to be a very, very different business. Yeah. And they're going to have to hire somebody who's better than most of the other people as a sort of partner for the founder. They've never done that before. They find that incredibly difficult. I'm working with somebody at the moment that's had 3 heads of sales in 5 years. Wow. So they've proved to themselves that they can't hire a head of sales. They know that. So now they've asked for some help. But, that's 5 years of pain and misery.
Yeah, and not to mention the cost of those transitions and, the length of time that affects the business as well. I mean, it's the reason I asked the question, the number one question I ask before I work with someone is that lifestyle versus growth question. And I actually, I suppose, coach them on the trade-offs before I'd even start some form of kind of, I suppose, commercial relationship or client relationship with them. And just take them through what this is going to look like. And the reason for that's important is I find that if someone's had a lifestyle business where they've been taking a lot of money out of their company for a period of time, they've got the Porsche or whatever it is, it's a great business that supported an amazing life. If they suddenly make that transition to growth, to your point, they're going to have to sacrifice some things.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're going to have to put all their cash pretty much back into the business if they're going to do this properly, because you have to have that, you have to get past the risk points. And, a lot of people, they can't do that. They don't want to do that. And I say, fine, that's okay. You don't have to go and compete with your mate down the golf club who sold his business for 8 figures. You don't have to do that, right? But it's a conscious choice if you want to go on that path.
Well, the other question I ask is, and then what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Particularly if people are working, loving it and working 40, 50 hours a week and love it, and then you sell it, what are you going to do? Like, there's only so much daytime TV you can watch and still not hate yourself, so often that is, a real challenge for people. I mean, I know people who've sold their businesses and then they're like, you did tell me I wouldn't know what to do. Now I'm going to have to start another business. And it's like,
or play a lot of golf, right?
Yeah.
Or do that, or do coaching and mentoring.
There is that.
I mean, it is the last chapter of my book is about the next act. And I'm doing it like an epilogue, which is, I almost could have started the book with it, but I thought, I'm going to leave it as the kind of final thought because, there is this thing like you've got to have that compelling future that you're leaning into, right? Whatever that is. Because if you haven't defined that, like particularly if you had a business 20 or 30 years, you're going to get sucked back into the idea that you're giving up your leg, or an arm or a kidney or whatever it is because it's something that's so attached to you.
Well, Dan Sullivan has just turned 80, the founder of Strategic Coach, and he'd just done sort of a retrospective where he said he's earned more money and had more impact on entrepreneurs globally in the last 10 years of his life, 70 to 80, than he'd had on the previous 50 years of his working career.
That's cool.
And so he's got a plan for like 80 to 90. How do I have twice the impact at 80 to 90 that I had at 70 to 80? And so that compelling future, it drives you if you've got one. And if you haven't got one, then, golf and daytime TV.
Yeah, you have to do it. And I do advise people to create that before a sales process. It doesn't necessarily become part of the mechanics of an exit plan, even though it's a key component of the whole thing. Because like quite often people just want to kind of get their business to a point where it's on a trajectory for their outcome. But through that process, you have to start thinking about it. Is how I look at it. And, it is true to say that people kind of, as we said, sabotage things. But the other thing I've seen to be true is a lot of their friends were tied up in their business. And once they're not involved anymore, like the person that, particularly when you used to go to a place of work all the time, that changes. And then other people see you differently. And unless you get yourself into another kind of community, if you like, or another group where people have had the same experience, which is again something that I do recommend, that's where it became very lonely.
Yes. I spoke to somebody the other day who said, they were depressed for 3 months. He said, but I could hardly ring somebody up, and because they're going to say, mate, you got tens of millions of pounds, shut the fuck up with your depression.
Yeah,
bollocks,
it's like, that yellow Ferrari. I wish I'd chosen like red. So woe is you, dude, right? It's funny. I do a lot of stuff out of America and hang out with some different groups and masterminds over there. And a lot of what I get involved in is going and doing some third world work, school building and things like that. And that's quite fun. So I do find if people find a philanthropic exercise or ambition for themselves as well, that does help. And plus having the nice Ferrari, but that's it.
Yeah. What books along the way have you found helpful, or do you think people who are on this journey should pick up and read? You got any suggestions?
I've got a few different ones. So one of the ones that I really love, and we talked about this before pressing record, is The Road Less Stupid by Keith Cunningham.
Yeah, very good.
Advice from the chairman of the board. The thing I like about this book is the way it talks about dumb mistakes. And there's some, avoid the dumb mistakes. And it's very, very clear about what those are. And I've made most of them, I'll be honest. In my CEO tenure, I've made most of them. But there's a really good bit in that book where he talks about thinking time. Not necessarily a new concept, but the idea that you give yourself 45 minutes to an hour with a journal once a week, and you ask questions like, what am I not seeing? What am I not seeing? So it allows you to kind of elevate above the business and start to think about all the things that are going on. And I quite like that, because sometimes as business owners, as entrepreneurs, we get sucked into the detail all the time, and that becomes a thing. Yeah. So I love that book. One that I have read recently, which is actually by Dan Sullivan, I think it's Benjamin Hardy, is 10X is better than 2X. Have you read that?
Yeah, I have. It's very good.
Yeah, I don't advise that to businesses that probably aren't at a 7-figure mark, because it can sort of get you a shiny object over here. But the thing I liked about that particular book is it talks about like the compounding effect of decision making. And sometimes we think too small when actually the bigger play, or the potential of a silver bullet exists with a bigger thought, or operating in a different way. And I often say to a lot of clients, one of the big things I learn in private equity is to get in the flow of money, right? Get in the flow of it. Don't try and create it necessarily, because the flow of money exists. And if you can define that within your industry, and certainly you can define it through how you exit a company, then it becomes a much easier pathway to execute against that. And there's a tenet of that in that book as well.
I've got some quick fire questions for you.
Go for it. Let's do it.
What's your genius?
Problem solving.
Okay. What drives you every day?
My family.
What unpopular opinion do you hold?
The private equity isn't as bad as people think.
What's the most significant risk you've taken?
The decision in 2018 to leave private equity without a plan to make sure that my family weren't going to suffer from the income and all the stuff that comes from being in private equity. Okay. So jumping off the cliff and going, how am I going to do this now? Which I had to trust the process and trust myself in that.
Okay. How do you measure success?
For me personally, it's about the amount of time that I have to do what I want, and combine with that the impact that I can make on others. And I just, I know that sounds a bit trite to some extent, but there was a point in my life when it was nothing like that, Dominic. It's about how much money I can bloody make at the expense of others. So for me, that's a big shift that I had to go through personally.
Okay. That sounds like you think you've become a nicer person.
Oh, I was an arsehole. I sometimes, when I speak on stage, put up a picture of Bobby Axelrod from the Showtime show Billions and say that was kind of what my world was like. I would have stepped on anybody to get the next paycheck or the next bonus. So I had to go through a lot of self-discovery. So now the idea that I can help other people and also kind of have a fantastic life sounds easy to correlate, but actually when you're wired or programmed in a certain way, sometimes you've got to change that programming.
Okay. What's the most recent thing you've learned or recent skill you've acquired?
For me, it's actually copywriting.
Okay.
Copywriting and just understanding using written word as a way of communication and influence. So I've been testing that out a lot on LinkedIn lately and just doing some different stuff and just seeing how it all works. So more of a kind of an algorithm behind it. And it's been really, really interesting. So it's a very practical thing, but I've enjoyed just kind of leaning into something like that.
What's your biggest source of inspiration?
My biggest, it's actually two people. So my grandfather brought me up because my father left when I was 2 years of age. And then he came back into my life 40 years later. And both of them were very interesting in their own right in terms of their entrepreneurial journey. And both were very disciplined. And so I look back at what I learned from my grandfather, which was grit. He was the first Australian to run a marathon after having a double bypass heart surgery. So I learned a lot. I was there the day, actually. It was 1984 when he came across the line in 4 hours and 10 minutes. And I still have behind me the picture of him doing that. And so I learned a lot about grit and determination from him. And then when I met my dad many years later, I learned more about, I suppose, being present and entrepreneurship and the idea of helping people without expectation, which I never really had growing up. So I'm inspired by those two people in terms of how I think about things now.
Okay. What's the worst business advice you've received?
God, do you want the list? Focus more on revenue than profit.
Okay.
I know you need both, but
yeah. And what do you think is the biggest myth in business?
I think the biggest myth in business is that entrepreneurship is for everyone.
Uh-huh.
I don't think it's necessarily for everybody.
What proportion of people do you think it's for?
I think you have to ask yourself, I'll answer the question, but I think you have to ask yourself some very serious questions about what it is. And by that, I mean, you have to really embrace the journey more than the outcome. And you have to like the idea that you can tolerate risk, you can live with uncertainty, you can have your best day and your worst day, and it can be the same day. I think that's the path that you go into. It has fantastic upside, but it also has lots of pretty dark moments. So in terms of percentage, 1%.
It's interesting. Vern Harnish has got a stat he quotes all the time. He says, look, 99% of businesses in North America only have one employee, and many of those are overstaffed.
So there you go. And it's interesting though, isn't it?
Well, yes, because they're not. They've just created jobs for themselves, which is not a bad thing, but it's a job rather than scaling a business, being an entrepreneur, creating wealth.
There is an interesting point around definition here, though, because I think the idea that you have to rely on someone else for your income is high risk these days. So, is an entrepreneur someone who just goes out and creates their own income, or is an entrepreneur someone who goes out to solve a meaningful problem in the world and is focused on doing whatever it takes to get to that outcome? And as a result of that, they get the sort of spoils, if you like, of that decision. So I think it depends. But I think entrepreneurship in its purest form is a challenging thing. It's not for everyone.
Yep. Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thanks for coming on.
Loved it, Dominic. Thank you very much.